And it's already been such a blessing this morning to be here today. I don't typically think of announcements or even sometimes our elders opening welcome as things that I get too excited about or emotional about, but today is certainly an exception. I really appreciate the things that Jay had to say, and especially his thoughtfulness in seeking out Jimmy Thomas to word our prayer for us this morning. That's a great blessing. And we have new members here, and as I stand up here, I get to always look out and see people and then know situations that people are going through and dealing with, and your presence is such a encouragement to me. This is truly the best seat in the house, and I see the things that people are doing in service to others, and it's incredibly moving. And to see all these young people sitting up front it means the world to me. Thank you, guys. Also, somebody said, who was that this morning on the devotional for this week? In case you don't know, that's Wyatt Smith. He's one of our high school juniors, I think. He is a junior this year, and he's been coming up to the building here every week, one day a week, and spending some time with Jarrett and I studying, and he presented the Devo for us this week, so look forward to that in your email. Well, we are in a series of lessons from the book of James. Many of us think of James as one of our very favorite books, and for good reason. And we're calling it Walking in Wisdom. Last week, Jarrett focused on chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, and spoke to us on the importance and the power of the tongue, the importance and the power of the words that we use. And he used a phrase that I think has really stuck with me. I hope it has you as well. He said, words make worlds. Words make worlds. And that's true for all of us, but especially for those of us who are in positions of authority, whatever the realm of authority might be that you operate in, as a mother or father, as a teacher, as a coach. All of us speak words into the life of other people that create the atmosphere and create the world that the people under that authority live in. And I think that is especially the case as we apply it today to our church, and as we think about the teachers that Jimmy prayed for, the preachers, the elders, those who are in positions of teaching and influence and leadership, create in a very sense the world in which we live in and the atmosphere in which we are living as a congregation, which is why James opened this section in chapter 3 and verse 1 with those words, "Not many of you should become teachers." I'll tell you, this is one of those verses in Scripture that is unsettling to me. And it causes you to go back and question yourself a lot. But I think that he still has this in mind as he's talking about words, though this applies to all of us. It is a special application for those who do teach, for those who are in positions of authority or influence or leadership. And it's extremely important that we are mindful of our words. And I think that theme of who are the teachers, who are the influencers and leaders within a group are still in mind as he comes to verses 13 through 18, which will be our focus today, which I believe is the heart of the book of James. I think this is not only the center of the book structurally, it is the heart of the book as well. And so I urge all of us who are in positions of leadership, those who have authority, or those perhaps who aspire to be, to please listen carefully to the things that James will say to us here. If you want to build something, your life, your family, your business, your community, and certainly the church, in a way that is going to be stable and that is going to endure and last and be a blessing to the people, then what James has to say to us in these words, these verses, is indispensable. I want to read it all together at once. Verses 13 through 18, he says, Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So he opens the section, we may notice, with that question that we saw on the previous slide, who is wise and understanding among you? I think it just goes without saying that those of us who teach or who preach or who shepherd or who lead in various ministries believe that they have a measure of wisdom or insight that qualifies them for the work. And that's not necessarily an arrogant thing. We don't want to bury our talents, and especially those talents that we might have that can be of benefit or blessing to other people. However, some are drawn to public positions, whether teachers or preachers or leadership roles, for the wrong reasons. And James identifies those reasons for us in our text. And he also shows us that when we are drawn to these roles for the wrong reasons, the results may not immediately, but eventually will prove to be disastrous for everyone. And so the title that I've come up with for today's lesson is Which Wisdom? For you see, as we have read through this, that James contrasts two kinds of wisdom, and he contrasts those two kinds of wisdom in three different ways. So let's do that. Let's consider that. He contrasts two kinds of wisdom in regards to their origin, their source, their operation, how they actually work, and to the outcome of applying these kinds of wisdoms to life. So we first want to look at the contrast in origin, these two kinds of wisdom. Where do they come from? And in verses 15 and 17, he says that such wisdom, false wisdom, really, is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. That's its source. This is where it is coming from. But verse 17 says the wisdom that comes from heaven is, and he then describes it for us. So there are two places, a wisdom that is earthly, sensual, or unspiritual, and demonic, or a wisdom that descends from heaven, that comes to us from above. So maybe this helps, this little chart, if you will, helps make it a little bit easier to put all this in perspective. He says that there's a false wisdom that emerges from below, that it comes up from underneath. But coming from the low place, it seeks to rise up. It seeks high, goes high to serve itself. So it's not by nature high. It comes from below, but it has its eyes set on that which is high. And it is, I will use this term, Luciferian in nature. And I'll explain that at the end of the lesson. And its watchword or its motivation or the key characteristic of this sort of wisdom is pride. In contrast to that, he tells us that there's this other wisdom, true wisdom, and it is a wisdom, he says, that descends from above as opposed to emerging from below. It descends from above, and it descends for the purpose of going low to serve. The other is striving high for the glory of self. This goes low for the purpose of serving those below. It is, as opposed to Luciferian, it is Christian, embodied ultimately in the person of Christ. And the key characteristic is humility, as opposed to pride. So there are a great contrast here of two wisdoms that could not be more different, that operate in the lives of real people. And I have no doubt in an assembly of this size that these two kinds of wisdom are operative in various degrees in the lives of people here. And it certainly is the case that it operates in the world around us, both varieties we see at work. But one of the things that I'd like to note in passing is that both of these wisdoms operate in us, come to us from the outside. They come from somewhere else. Did you notice that? Wisdom that comes from below, and there's a wisdom that comes from behind. It comes to us, and that we then embody that wisdom. You know, we often talk about, I've got an idea. Somebody said, no, it's not really the case. Ideas have you. Isn't that true? It's like these things take possession of us, and they work their will through us, and they manifest themselves in our words and in our actions. And they're coming from either above or they're coming from beneath. We're like hardware in a computer or an iPhone. Our minds and our bodies are physical instruments that are used by spiritual things, a spiritual code, if you will, or an app that runs on the hardware. And in order to get programmed, for our instrument to get programmed by the wisdom from below or the wisdom of the world is easy. All you have to do is just absorb the culture around you. Just watch enough reality TV, watch and follow enough social media influencers. Just watch the ways of the world, and you will very easily adopt this program. And it will run through you, and you will be its instrument, its servant, and manifest its wisdom in your life. Back in the 80s, young people, you might appreciate this. We used to hear preachers all the time warning us about there were three things. It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Okay, those are the three things as a young person you had to be careful about. And on the rock and roll thing, back in the 80s, there was this big thing about backmasking. Y'all know what I'm talking about? Backmasking. It's like if you played the record or you played the tape in reverse, you would hear these metal bands and heavy rock groups expressing these messages, these satanic messages. And preachers would warn us about, if you play this stuff backwards, it says, I love the devil, or something like that. And it was always funny to me because it was like, you don't have to play them backwards to hear that they worship the devil. It's like they say that playing it forwards. What's the thing about playing it backwards? And that actually is quite interesting because you may have heard of Anton LaVey. He was the founder of the Church of Satan in the late 60s. And he basically said, you already worship the devil. You might as well be honest about it. You already worship the devil. You may as well admit it. And that's true. If you're driven by greed, if you're driven by lust, if you're driven by ambition and status and power, then if those are the motivating forces that are working through your life, if these are the apps and the programs that are running through your hardware, then you worship the devil, and you may as well be honest about it. That's why James says in verse 14, if you harbor bitter envy or are self-seeking in your hearts, don't lie and deny it. And so we ought to be honest. If we absorb our wisdom from the surrounding culture, from the world, and from the pit of hell itself, we ought to at least have the courage to acknowledge it. But to receive God's wisdom from above and to make it the operating software in our lives, we must be deliberate. We can't be passive. We have to be deliberate in our choices about receiving it. And I'm not going to go into this because we, as preachers, again, we talk about this all the time. There's basically three ways that we do this. We nurture a healthy fear of the Lord. Proverbs 9:10, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. To have a reverence for the Creator God, to be in awe, to stand in awe and be amazed at the power, at the goodness, at the holiness of the Creator of heaven and earth is the beginning place for wisdom, because it puts you in your place. There is a God, and I'm not Him. And until you have that fundamental proposition in place in your life, you're not going to be wise in the sense of the wisdom that descends from above. Secondly, we've got to prioritize time in the Word and time in prayer so that we're getting those daily updates to our software so that we are constantly being renewed in our minds. And then we got to spend time with, hang out with other people who are seeking first God's kingdom and not our own little kingdoms. But not only does he contrast the two different sources of wisdom, he also contrasts the way that they actually operate in the world. And so in verses 14 and 17, he puts it this way: if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, this is the way that the wisdom of the world, the wisdom from below, operates. Verse 17, on the other hand, the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. So it gives us two words to describe the wisdom from below and 8 to describe the wisdom from above. And James recognizes that people can be drawn into public roles in the church because of bitter envy or selfish ambition. Recognizing that public positions, being a teacher, for instance, garners attention, it garners status within a group. And so a person can very easily be motivated in their teaching and leading or worship leading or being an elder, not out of a desire to build up the church and serve the people, but out of a desire of being put on a pedestal. Paul recognized the same thing and writes about it in Philippians 1:15, where he said, some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. And so if we want status, if we want to be honored among men, this is the wrong motivation. And then secondly, in contrast to that, we have him describing the wisdom from above and how it operates using 8 words. And we're not going to go into a specific word-by-word definition of this. He's trying to give us a portrait of a person, a description of the general character of someone who should be a teacher, someone who should be a leader. And so before every trimester here at Lost River, when we begin to teach our new class, if you're a teacher, of children all the way through adults, before every sermon, before every elders meeting, before every committee meeting that you're a part of, ask yourself if these 8 things are operating in your life and are motivating what you're bringing to that event. He talks about at the beginning and end, pure and sincere. I don't think here necessarily he has in mind moral purity, maybe as we think about that, sexual purity, though certainly that's the case. I think the idea here is that sincerity of heart, that you have a genuineness about it, that your purpose and your motivations are pure in why you're doing the things you're doing. Let us always remember, leaders, teachers, why are we doing the things that we're doing? And if we're ever doing what we're doing for the empty praise of men, then we've completely lost what it's all about. Secondly, he talks about peace loving. That is, teachers shouldn't be people who are looking for a fight. As you read through the book of James, you very much get the sense, as he's sending this letter out to these Jewish Christians scattered around the Roman Empire, that there's a lot of conflict going on among Christian congregations. And he's trying to help them work through that and see what the problem is. And part of the problem he's saying is too many teachers are teaching out of a motivation that is wrong, including a desire to just argue, fuss, and fight. Now, I will tell you, growing up and when I was a young person, there were a certain set of preachers That's what they were characterized by, and that's what they were known for, and that's what they aspired to be, were people who just argued and fought and debated constantly. And it just kept the church always in a state of turmoil and upheaval. But here he says the wisdom from above isn't looking for a fight, it's looking for a way to be at peace. It's considerate. It thinks about the needs of others, not only itself. The NIV says submissive, and I think it's an appropriate translation. I really like the way the ESV puts it better, open to reason. A leader, a teacher who will actually listen to what other people have to say and is open to considering a different point of view. He's merciful and full of good fruits. Impartial is an important word. As teachers and leaders, we cannot be guilty of taking sides just on the basis of somebody being my friend, or they have sort of the kind of ideology that I subscribe to, or maybe they're wealthier or more powerful, or they're rich and oppressed, and so I'm going to make my decisions on what I'm going to do based on which group that I want to fit in with. That sort of partiality is ruinous for a church. We have to make decisions and do our teaching based on what is fair and good for everyone concerned. And so those are some characteristics about how these two wisdoms operate in the world. Selfish ambition and bitter envy on the one hand versus these 8 characteristics on the other. And why this matters so much is in the third contrast that James makes. It matters so much because of the outcome. Each of these kinds of wisdom ends up in a radically different outcome. In verse 16, he says, "For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice." Disorder and every evil practice, where selfish ambition and envy are the motivating factors. On the other hand, in verse 18, those who operate on the basis of the wisdom from above are peacemakers who sow in peace. This is how they go about their work. What's the promise? They reap a harvest of righteousness. And so when he talks about the wisdom from below, he says there's confusion. This literally means a disorder that comes from instability. And I think the ultimate example or illustration of this would be the Tower of Babel, right? In which the people, they were able to come together and make common cause for a while. And their common cause was, we want to make a name for ourselves. This is that Luciferian principle that is low, but it wants to be high. And so we're going to build a tower that reaches up into the heavens and make a name for ourselves. Nobody will forget who we are. And they were able to get a certain distance on this. But as is always the case when people are filled with envy and self-seeking, eventually they're going to fall apart. And God miraculously is involved in this, but I think He's also teaching us a larger principle that ultimately things that are built on a Luciferian foundation, a wisdom that emerges from below, that aspires to be high and make much of oneself, is ultimately going to reach a point where everyone in it just turns against each other, to the point that no longer can they even communicate with one another. And they end up having to abandon the task altogether. And the history of man is that in every instance where we try to come together to build something up, to make our name great, to reach up into the heavens and, as it were, even displace the position of God, we will always find ourselves collapsing, falling apart, and in disorder. Confusion will reign. And he says, as a result, there will be every evil practice. I like the way it's going to be bad, he says, people. It's a hot mess, you would say, in our day and time. And isn't that kind of the state, sadly, of our country today? And if it is, the one thing that we as Christians and as the church here at Lost River, we want to not do is imitate the wisdom of the world that leads to that kind of place. And if we let envy and self-seeking become our motivation, it will undermine the beautiful unity and vital mission that Christ intends for his people. But if we subscribe to the wisdom from above, the outcome could not be any more different. He says, when we sow in peace, we reap a reward of righteousness, of stability, of justice, of harmony, of goodwill. Now, I don't know how dark it's going to get out there in the world. I'm afraid it's going to get darker than we've seen it yet. But if we heed the words that James has for us here, we'll be a light in that dark place. We'll be salt in the earth, and we'll be a refuge of peace for ourselves and for others who are looking for that wisdom from above. So I want to close this morning by returning to this slide and then reading a couple of passages that I think really illustrate it. The false wisdom that emerges from beneath, that seeks to go high in order to exalt itself, is Luciferian, and I've highlighted the word here, rooted in pride, versus the true wisdom that descends from above and goes low to serve others is Christian and based on humility. We see two passages that really illustrate what I'm trying to get across, or what James ultimately is trying to get across with this. The first is in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 15, where he says, "How you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the dawn." You have, and the word Lucifer there in many modern translations is translated morning star. It's literally a reference to the planet Venus that shines in the sky like a star. But it's a reference in the context to the king of Babylon, but many see in it the deeper principle of a description of Satan himself. So you have, how far you have fallen, O Lucifer, you son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth, you who had once laid low the nations. Notice how this fall has come about. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of the assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Do you see this movement? It is a movement of striving to go ever and ever higher, to make more and more of oneself, and ultimately unable to sustain it, it results in an inglorious collapse, bringing an unmitigated and irredeemable shame forever and ever. There couldn't be a stronger example of what James is driving at when he talks about the wisdom from below that's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. But set that in contrast with the passage that Jarrett and I use all the time. And I think I've thought about not using it because we use it so much, but I'm like, no, we use it so much for a reason. And look at how it's just the absolute opposite of what we just read. He tells us in Philippians 2, beginning in verse 5, in your relationships with one another have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or held onto or used to his own advantage. But rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself even more by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Do you see how the Luciferian way is to try to rise and exalt oneself up higher, higher, higher? And the Jesus way is to humble oneself willfully and voluntarily for the benefit of those who are lower. And so, as a result of that humble descent of Jesus, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him, not because he took it for himself, but God gave it to him. He gave him a name above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. You know why we do that? Why we gather every Sunday and remember him at the memorial, at the Lord's Supper service, and sing these songs in which we continually speak of his glory and praise. It's not because Jesus beat back all of his enemies and climbed his way by stepping on everybody else's face and finally reached the top. And now all of us who are underneath the pile of rubble that he left behind are reluctantly brought to the point of having to acknowledge he's the king of the hill. That is not it. It is because he is the one who so willingly and out of love humbled himself to the grave to serve us, to deliver us from an oppression that we could never have set ourselves free from. And because he went all the way down, and God has now lifted him up, and we see him, and out of love and out of honor, and out of a heart full of delight, want to give our praise to him who is in the highest place. You see, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And so we as individuals and as a church will share one of these two destinies. The way up in the kingdom is down in humble service. And so the admonition, again, is to all of us in our homes, and especially as you rise up in places of authority in the home, as a mother, as a father, as a leader in your industry, as leaders in the community, and most of all here in the church, as we strive to use the talents and gifts that God gives us to serve others, making sure and checking ourselves that our motivations are right and that we are operating according to the wisdom that is descended from above, and not the Luciferian wisdom that emerges from beneath. Well, if you're not a Christian, we want to appeal to you on the basis of what we have shared today to come to Christ and acknowledge that he is who God has made him to be, the exalted one, the humble king who came out of love to serve you and to meet you where you are and to provide for your greatest needs, to acknowledge him as Lord and as Savior, and to subscribe to his wisdom and his way. If you humble yourself before him, he'll lift you up with him. And if we can help you in that regard by coming and you're willing to confess his name and be baptized, we'll be happy to help you in that. And if we can serve you in some other way, let us know while we stand and while we sing.